Hi, I'm Catalina Edwards, and I will be guiding you all through the case of the Supreme Court case of Price Waterhouse versus Hopkins, which was set in 1989. So let's talk a little bit about the case. So the plaintiff here was Ann Hopkins, and the defendant was Price Waterhouse. I'm going to put a brief description. Ann took Price Waterhouse to court and sued them because she felt that her rights were violated under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, where she felt like she was discriminated against because of her sex. In the district court, they ruled in Ann's favor. So they did find that there was some violations of her rights regarding sex. The appeals court also found the same thing, but a little bit of a difference in the way that they looked at motives, and we'll go into that in the later slides. The Supreme Court took this case on by way of certiorari, and they also ruled in Hopkins' favor, and we'll go a little bit into detail as to why that's important and what they ruled for. So how did this case progress through our legal system to the Supreme Court? So basically, Anne was proposed for partnership in 1982, okay? And her candidacy was held for reconsideration for the following year. And then the following year, she was refused her proposal for candidacy. At that point in time, Anne sued Price Waterhouse under what she believed was discrimination on the basis of sex. The judge in the district court ruled in Ann's favor, but there was a question of the rights of liabilities, right? So how much proof burden do you actually have to carry? And that's what ended up in appeals court as well. So in the appeals court, they ruled that the district court was correct in ruling in Ann's favor, but that there was discrepancy in the way in which they decided the burden of proof that was needed for mixed cases. So when we talk about a mixed case, and this is actually what's really important for this case, is that it was her candidacy for partner was denied due to the fact that she had some legitimate and illegitimate reasons in whereby she was not given that raise. And when we defined legitimate is, reasons where she really didn't deserve the role, and illegitimate is considered one that goes against her civil rights, okay? Again, the court progressed through the district court, then the appeals court, and then the Supreme Court ruled also in favor of Anne and agreed that that was the right decision, and agree with those courts. But in the respective of burden of proof between the defendant and the plaintiff, there was a difference, and we'll go through a little bit in the next slides. So again, the Supreme Court ruled that the employment decision was made with legitimate and illegitimate motives, and that's what makes this case really interesting. So what's up with Anne, right? What's the background on Ann Hopkins, and what brought her to court? Why was she here? So Anne was a very successful senior manager in Price Waterhouse. She worked out of the DC office, and she was there for 5 years. She actually managed to secure a $25 million contract. At that time, that was the biggest contract they had in that office, and it was for the State Department. So the partners at Hopkins' office praised her character as well as all of her accomplishments. Price Waterhouse claims that Hopkins was very brute with her staff, and that she was very direct, and that some of her folks suffered her wrath, and that she really needed to work on her relationship building. Okay. They actually documented this in her files, as well documented that they had issues with the way that she comported herself with other employees. But they also documented that she progressed and she actually had gotten better. So when Ann's partnership was declined for the second year in a row, she sued Price Waterhouse, saying that there was illegitimate reasons as to why she didn't get the role, not just her performance, because her performance was good. And she filed a suit alleging sex discrimination. That was the important part here. So let's talk a little bit about point of views. So what did Ann put forward, and what did Price Waterhouse put forth? So Ann Hopkins, she argued that the employer violates Title VII when it allows any of its employees to take part in violating any part of Title VII with their employment decisions. So Ann would say, it's the employer's responsibility to ensure that their employees aren't violating those rights, and altogether. What Price Waterhouse was a little bit different, and they argued that they would only violate Title VII if they gave decisive consideration to an employee, gender, race, national origin, or religion in making decisions which affects the employees. So basically what they were saying is that the employee's burden to show that the decision would have been different if the employer had not discriminated. So Price Waterhouse was saying it is the employee's responsibility to show proof that Price Waterhouse did something illegitimate or wrong. And Ann was saying that no, that's not the case, that the employer needs to make sure that they understand that they are responsible for their employees when they act against their civil rights. So let's talk about the district court, okay? So what did the district court rule and why? So the ruling was that Price Waterhouse had unlawfully discriminated against Hopkins on the basis of sex. So the ruling went to Ann and to Hopkins. Why did they rule that? So the judge deemed that Price Waterhouse had consciously given merit to partners whose comments were only really derived from sex stereotypes. So, for example, Anne needed to be more female. She needed to wear more makeup, and they gave merit to that. Okay, and because they gave merit to that, then that they were violating her rights. So in this case, they had some evidence that they did discriminate based on sex stereotypes, and then they had other legitimate reasons, such as her being very stern with her staff. So there was a mixed motives case, and that's really important to note here. The details and what's really important for the specific district court case is that the judge ruled that if the employer could prove with clear and convincing evidence that they made the partner decision without discrimination, then the case would have gone to Price Waterhouse. But they didn't. They couldn't prove it with clear and convincing evidence. So this actually leads us to the Court of Appeals, where Price Waterhouse takes Ann to Court of Appeals, right? And the Court of Appeals again says the same thing. So they ruled that Price Waterhouse had unlawfully discriminated against Hopkins on the basis of sex. But the difference here was that not only did they rule that, but they disagreed in the way that the district court delineated their need to prove, right? So their burden of proof. So in this case, a judge ruled that if the employer did not have to prove with clear and convincing evidence, they just needed a preponderance of evidence. So it was two different things. So because of that, the district court and the appeals court differed, although their ruling was the same, which leads this case to the Supreme Court. So what happens in the Supreme Court? So in the Supreme Court, the case was brought there to determine the respective burdens of proof. So how do we know, is it a preponderance of evidence or is it clear and convincing? So the ruling was that Price Waterhouse had unlawfully discriminated against Hopkins on the basis of sex. Again, the judge deemed that Price Waterhouse had consciously given merit to the partners, comments that were only derived from sexual stereotypes. But here are the details, and here's what's important about this case. So the judge ruled that the employer did not have to prove with clear and convincing evidence that they made a partner decision. What the Supreme Court ruled and established is that in a mixed motive case, okay, the employer needs to prove that they would have the same decision with or without the discrimination. So they actually looked at what the district court ruled with and ruled very close to that. All right. So how is this important? Let's go into that. So why does this case matter, right? So now all of a sudden the employer-employee relationship has changed. So here's what this means to us, right? So prior to this case, it was the employee's responsibility to show proof, clear and convincing, or preponderance thereof, evidence that they were being discriminated against. In this case, that's no longer the case. The case now is a little bit different. The case is where if you are discriminated against, whether there's legitimate, and if there is legitimate or illegitimate motives, so you've got a mixed motive case, then the employer has to prove that even without the illegitimate claims, they would have acted in such a fashion, right? So that's really important. And that's the importance of this case, where prior to this case, it wasn't the case. In a mixed motive, the employee would have to prove that burden of proof. So what happened to Ann Hopkins? So in 1990, she actually was awarded her partnership and her damages, which was great. So she actually rejoined Price Waterhouse as a partner in 1990, and she was awarded back pay plus interest. And then she, some additional details that she was later verified that she paid about $300,000 in her taxes, and her award that also paid her attorney's fee due and owing them. So we can thank Ann for bringing this case to our courts and allowing us to have our employee rights in a way where when we have a case or a situation when there's legitimate and illegitimate claims against us, then the employer has to prove that they would have acted the same way, even if there was illegitimate claims. That's it. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation.